You know how some days start off so ordinary that you don't think twice about them. That's exactly how this day began for me. I woke up to the soft chirping of birds outside my window, the kind of sound that makes you feel like everything is right in the world. My dog, Max, was curled up at the foot of my bed, snoring softly. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as it turned out. I shuffled into the kitchen, still in my pajamas, and started making coffee. The aroma of freshly ground beans filled the air, and I could already feel the calmness of the day wrapping around me. I grabbed my favorite mug, the one with the little crack on the handle, and poured myself a steaming cup. As I sipped it, I decided to step outside to grab the newspaper. You know, just a normal Saturday morning routine. But when I opened the front door, my heart nearly stopped. There, in what used to be my backyard, was a scene straight out of a construction zone. Dirt was piled high, orange cones dotted the area, and men in hard hats were busy setting up tools and equipment. The quiet hum of generators and the clanging of metal echoed through the air. It looked like chaos had exploded where my peaceful garden used to be. What on earth? I muttered, staring at the mess in disbelief. One of the workers noticed me standing there, frozen in shock, and gave me a cheerful wave. "Good morning," he called out. "We're just getting started on the pool installation." "The asterisk what asterisk?" I asked, my voice rising higher than I intended. I must have sounded ridiculous, but honestly, who wouldn't? He pointed to a clipboard tucked under his arm. "It's all here in the plans. Maplewood Lane HOA approved a community pool for Lot 24. My stomach dropped. Lot 24. That was asterisk my asterisk lot. And the craziest part, I wasn't even a member of the HOA. I'd never joined, never paid dues, never signed anything agreeing to let anyone dig up my backyard. Yet here they were, treating my property like it belonged to them. I stood there, dumbfounded, as the reality sank in. These people were building a pool in my yard without asking me, without telling me, without any kind of permission whatsoever. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life or wandered onto the set of a bad TV show. But no, this was real. This was happening to asterisk me asterisk. Max trotted up beside me, wagging his tail, completely unfazed by the commotion. He barked once, probably wondering why these strangers were invading his turf. I bent down to pet him, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Who gave them the authority to do this? And most importantly, how was I going to stop it? The worker seemed oblivious to my distress. He went back to hammering away at something, leaving me standing there, clutching my coffee mug like it was a lifeline. I glanced at the piles of dirt again, then at the blueprint sticking out of the guy's clipboard. Something inside me snapped. This was my home, my sanctuary. No one, not the HOA, not these workers, not anyone, had the right to take that away from me. I marched over to the foreman, determination bubbling in my chest. "Excuse me," I said, my voice firmer now. "There's been a huge mistake. This is private property. You can't build anything here without my permission." The man blinked at me, clearly surprised by my sudden assertiveness. "Well, Mom," he replied, scratching his head, "we've got orders. If there's a problem, you'll need to talk to the HOA." And just like that, my anger shifted. Because if there was one thing I knew about the HOA, it was that they didn't play fair. Whatever battle I was about to face, it wasn't going to be easy. But as I stared at the destruction in my backyard, I realized something. I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. I stormed straight to Susan Whittaker's house, the clipboard queen of Maplewood Lane and president of the HOA. My heart was racing, my hands gripping the crumpled blueprint like it was evidence in a courtroom drama. I didn't even bother knocking, just marched right up to her front door and rang the bell so hard I thought it might break. When Susan answered, she looked surprised but quickly plastered on her usual polished smile. "Oh, hello," she chirped, as if we were about to discuss flower arrangements or holiday decorations. "What brings you here?" "This," I said, shoving the blueprint into her hands. "Care to explain why there's a construction crew tearing up my backyard for a pool that I never approved?" Her smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered with practiced ease. Adjusting her glasses, she glanced at the document before handing it back. "Ah, yes, the community pool project. It's an exciting development for the neighborhood." "Exciting," I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "It's happening on my property without my permission." Susan crossed her arms, her tone shifting from cheerful to patronizing. "Technically," she began, drawing out the word like it was some kind of magic spell, "your lot falls within our jurisdiction. When you purchased the property, you implicitly agreed to abide by certain communal guidelines." "Implicitly agreed. Implicitly?" I sputtered, throwing my hands in the air. "What does that even mean? Did I sign something saying it's okay to destroy my yard whenever you feel like it?" She sighed dramatically, as if dealing with me was such a burden. "We're trying to enhance the community, dear. Pools increase property values for everyone, including you." That line hit me like a punch to the gut. Property values. Was that all this was about? A shiny new pool to make their precious neighborhood look better on paper? This wasn't about improving lives. It was about control. And suddenly, I realized how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. "But I'm not even part of your HOA," I shot back. "I never joined, never paid dues, nothing. How can you possibly justify doing this to someone who isn't even involved?" Susan tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Whether you're officially a member or not, living here means adhering to the association's rules. You benefit from the community standards we uphold. Surely you see that." "No, Susan, I don't see that," I snapped. "I see people trampling over my rights because it's convenient for them. That's not a community. It's a dictatorship." For the first time, her composure cracked. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes narrowed slightly. But instead of arguing further, she gave me a tight-lipped smile and patted my shoulder, like I was some petulant child throwing a tantrum. "Let's discuss this rationally, shall we? The pool will be a wonderful addition. Trust me, you'll thank us later." Trust her. The audacity made my blood boil. This wasn't rationality. It was manipulation. She wasn't listening to me. She was dismissing me, treating my objections like minor inconveniences to brush aside. As I walked away from her house, fuming, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was way out of my depth. Susan wasn't just going to roll over and admit she'd made a mistake. No, this was bigger than her. It was systemic. The HOA operated like a machine, cold and calculating, steamrolling over anyone who dared question its authority. By the time I got home, the workers were still busy in my backyard, oblivious to the chaos they'd unleashed. I stood at the edge of the destruction, staring at the piles of dirt and concrete forms that now marked where my garden used to be. Max trotted up beside me, wagging his tail like nothing had changed. If only life were that simple. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual. Every shadow moved suspiciously. My mind raced with questions. Why had no one warned me about this clause when I bought the house? Who else had been bulldozed over like this? And most importantly, how was I supposed to fight back against something so powerful? I realized then that this wasn't just about saving my backyard. It was about standing up for myself in a place that felt increasingly hostile. If I backed down now, what would stop them from taking more? After leaving Susan's house, I was fuming. My mind raced with questions and emotions. Anger, confusion, disbelief, all swirling around like a storm I couldn't calm. The audacity of the HOA to claim my backyard as their own felt surreal, almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. But laughter wasn't going to solve anything. I needed answers, and fast. I called Matt, my older brother, who always seemed to have an opinion on everything. He wasn't a lawyer, but he liked to think he was one thanks to his late-night binge-watching of legal dramas. When I explained what had happened, he listened quietly for a moment before offering surprisingly practical advice. "Check your deed," he said firmly. "There might be something in there that gives them wiggle room." So, after hanging up, I dug out the dusty folder where I kept all my important documents. It was buried deep in the back of my closet, under old receipts and manuals I'd never read. Finally finding it, I spread the papers across my dining table, grabbed a cup of coffee, and got to work. At first glance, everything seemed normal. A description of the property, boundary lines, tax information. Nothing jumped out at me as suspicious. But then, tucked away in the fine print, I found it. A single sentence granting the HOA limited discretionary rights over certain parts of residential lots. Limited? Discretionary. What did that even mean? The language was vague, intentionally so it seemed. They hadn't spelled out exactly what those rights entailed, leaving plenty of room for interpretation or manipulation. At first, I thought maybe this clause justified their actions. Maybe my backyard really did fall into some gray area they could exploit. But the more I read, the angrier I became. The wording specifically referred to undeveloped portions of lots. Undeveloped. That didn't describe my yard at all. I had spent months turning it into a cozy little retreat, planting flowers, setting up a small patio set, and letting Max dig holes wherever he pleased. By no stretch of the imagination could my backyard qualify as undeveloped. This realization hit me like a ton of bricks. They weren't just bending the rules. They were outright ignoring them. And yet, here they were, bulldozing ahead without a second thought about how it affected me. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about power. The HOA wanted control, plain and simple, and they didn't care who they trampled over to get it. Matt suggested I consult a real lawyer next, someone who could decipher the legalese and tell me whether I had a case. But the idea made my stomach churn. Lawyers cost money, money I didn't have to spare. Plus, taking on the HOA felt like stepping into a battlefield armed with nothing but a slingshot. These people thrived on intimidation, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of fight. Still, I couldn't let them win without trying. So I decided to reason with them again, hoping logic might break through their ironclad determination. I drafted a polite but firm letter explaining why their claim didn't hold water. I cited the specific language from my deed, pointed out the improvements I'd made to the yard, and politely requested they halt construction until we resolved the issue. Sending off the letter gave me a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they'd see reason. Maybe they'd realize they'd overstepped and agreed to fix things. Deep down, though, I knew better. People like Susan didn't back down easily. If anything, my letter probably annoyed her more than anything else. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual. Every shadow moved suspiciously. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. What if they ignored my letter completely? What if they tried to evict me or slap me with fines I couldn't afford? Or worse, what if they finished the pool and left me with no recourse? Max sensed my anxiety and curled up closer to me, resting his head on my lap. His warmth brought a small measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm brewing inside me. This wasn't just about a backyard anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my home, and refusing to let anyone take that away from me, even if it meant facing the HOA head-on. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I couldn't shake the image of the growing hole in my backyard, or the sound of hammers and drills echoing through what used to be my peaceful little sanctuary. I knew I had to act quickly before things spiraled even further out of control. So I threw on some clothes, grabbed a notebook and pen, and headed outside to confront the construction crew again. When I arrived, the scene was worse than I'd imagined. The hole had deepened, concrete forms were being laid out, and rebar was stacked neatly along the edges. It was as if they were determined to make this nightmare permanent before I could even blink. Panic bubbled inside me as I realized how fast they were moving. If I didn't stop them soon, my yard would be gone forever, and replaced with something I never asked for. I approached Carl, the foreman, who seemed to be overseeing everything. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You need to halt construction right now. This is still my property, and I haven't given permission for any of this." Carl frowned, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to budge. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but we're under strict orders. We can't just stop mid-project. You'll have to take it up with the HOA." "Take it up with the HOA?" I repeated incredulously. "I already did, and you're telling me that doesn't matter?" He shrugged helplessly. "All I know is what's on paper. As far as I'm concerned, this lot belongs to the association." His words stung, not because they were surprising, but because they were so dismissive. He wasn't the villain here. He was just doing his job. But that didn't make it hurt any less. These people weren't seeing me as a person. They were treating me like an obstacle to bulldoze over, quite literally. Frustrated, I turned to one of the workers nearby who was hammering away at a piece of wood. "Doesn't anyone care that this isn't their land? How can you justify building something without the owner's consent?" The man paused for a moment, looking at me with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. Then he shrugged. "Not my problem, ma'am. I just follow orders." His response infuriated me. Not his problem. How could it not be his problem? They were tearing apart my home, and no one seemed willing to take responsibility. It felt like I was invisible, shouting into a void while the world carried on around me. That night, sleep was impossible. Every noise, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, made me jumpy. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they tried to evict me? What if they claimed eminent domain and took my house entirely? Or worse, what if they finished the pool and left me stuck with the bill? Max stayed close to me, sensing my unease. His presence was comforting, but it wasn't enough to silence the storm brewing in my head. This wasn't just about losing my backyard anymore. It was about feeling powerless, like I didn't have a say in my own life. The HOA had come in like a force of nature, unyielding and unstoppable, and I didn't know how to fight back. As dawn broke, I found myself pacing my living room, replaying every conversation I'd had with Susan, Carl, and the workers. Something had to give. I couldn't let them win, not without a fight. But fighting an organization like the HOA felt daunting, almost impossible. They thrived on rules and intimidation, and I was just one person standing in their way. Still, I refused to give up. If reasoning wouldn't work, maybe exposing the truth would. Maybe I could find others who felt the same way I did, neighbors tired of being pushed around by Susan and her clipboard army. Together, we might stand a chance. Alone, I was vulnerable. But united, we could be stronger than any bulldozer or bureaucracy. With renewed determination, I sat down at my kitchen table and started writing. Letters to neighbors, notes detailing everything that had happened, plans for gathering evidence. It all spilled onto the page. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. The battle wasn't over yet. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop fighting this battle alone. If the HOA thought they could steamroll over me without consequences, they were wrong. But taking them on by myself felt impossible. I needed allies, people who understood what was at stake and were willing to stand with me. So I put on my walking shoes, grabbed a stack of flyers I'd hastily printed the night before, and started knocking on doors. At first, I wasn't sure how my neighbors would react. Some might side with the HOA, afraid of rocking the boat or drawing attention to themselves. Others might not care enough to get involved. But as I went door to door, I found that many shared my frustrations. They just hadn't had the courage to speak up yet. Take Mrs. Peterson, for example. She opened her door cautiously, clutching her robe tightly around her. When I explained why I was there, she hesitated. "I don't want any trouble," she murmured, glancing nervously towards Susan's house down the street. "I get it," I said gently. "But if we don't stand together now, they'll keep pushing us around. Look what happened with your RV last year." That struck a nerve. Her lips tightened, and after a moment she nodded. "Fine, count me in." Not everyone was so quick to join. One neighbor outright refused, muttering something about keeping the peace. Another claimed he didn't have time for drama. But slowly, support began to build. By the end of the day, I'd gathered a small group of like-minded residents, eager to challenge the HOA's authority. Among them were Rachel and James, a young couple who lived 2 houses down. They invited me inside for coffee, their eyes burning with quiet defiance. "We've been waiting for someone to take a stand," Rachel admitted. "Susan runs this neighborhood like it's her personal kingdom." "It's exhausting," James chimed in. "And it's not just you. Remember when they fined us for painting our front door teal? Said it disrupted the aesthetic harmony." He rolled his eyes dramatically. "It's ridiculous." Together, we started brainstorming ideas. Rachel suggested documenting everything: the construction progress, interactions with workers, even copies of letters exchanged with the HOA. James proposed reaching out to other disgruntled neighbors and encouraging them to share their stories. The more evidence we collected, the stronger our case would be. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly. Armed with cameras, notebooks, and sheer determination, we captured every detail of the chaos unfolding in my backyard. We interviewed residents, many of whom confessed similar grievances: unreasonable fines, ignored complaints, and a general lack of transparency from the HOA. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in the organization's polished facade. One breakthrough came when an elderly neighbor named Mr. Harris revealed he kept records of past disputes between homeowners and the HOA. His files included emails, meeting minutes, and even audio recordings of heated discussions. "Figured someday someone might need these," he said with a sly smile. "Looks like today's the day." With each new piece of information, our confidence grew. What started as a lonely fight against an unstoppable force was turning into a united front. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we actually stood a chance. When we finally scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to present our findings, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Susan wouldn't back down without a fight, and neither would her loyal supporters. But as I looked around at the growing number of allies standing beside me, I realized something important. Power isn't always about strength. It's about unity. Together, we were stronger than any rulebook or clipboard-wielding president. This wasn't just about saving my backyard anymore. It was about reclaiming control, restoring fairness, and reminding everyone on Maplewood Lane that this neighborhood belonged to *us*, not the HOA. Whatever happened next, I knew we were ready. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived, and my nerves were stretched tighter than a guitar string. I spent hours preparing, reviewing documents, rehearsing what I wanted to say, and mentally bracing myself for Susan's inevitable pushback. By the time I walked into the community center where the meeting was being held, my hands were clammy, but my resolve was solid. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who'd been pushed around by the HOA for too long. The room buzzed with tension as neighbors filed in, some curious, others anxious. Susan sat at the head of the table, her clipboard resting neatly in front of her like a shield. She wore her usual polished smile, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of unease that told me she knew something big was coming. Rachel, James, and a few other allies sat beside me, their presence giving me strength. We weren't alone in this fight anymore. When the meeting began, Susan tried to take control right away. "Let's keep things brief," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "We have important matters to discuss." I leaned forward, placing my stack of papers on the table. "Actually, Susan, we do have something important to discuss. Something you've conveniently ignored." Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "And what would that be?" "This." I slid the photos of the construction site across the table, followed by copies of the deed, the HOA charter, and testimonies from neighbors. You approved a pool to be built on private property without the owner's permission. Not only that, but you're misinterpreting the rules to justify it. Susan's composure cracked slightly, though she tried to mask it with a dismissive wave. This is preposterous. The lot falls under our jurisdiction. We're improving the neighborhood for everyone. Rachel spoke up then, her voice calm but sharp. Improving it for who? You bulldozed over her rights without even asking. How does that benefit anyone except yourselves? James chimed in next, holding up one of Mr. Harris's old emails. And let's not forget all the other times you've bullied people into compliance. Fines for ridiculous things, threats of legal action. It's gone on long enough. One by one, others joined in, sharing their own stories of frustration. Mrs. Peterson recounted how they'd shamed her for parking her RV in her driveway. Another neighbor talked about being fined for planting flowers that didn't match the approved palette. Even quieter residents found the courage to speak up, their voices adding weight to our argument. Susan looked increasingly rattled, glancing between her supporters, who now seemed unsure of themselves. For years, she'd operated with impunity, assuming no one would dare challenge her authority. But here we were, united and unyielding. Finally, I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. This isn't just about my backyard. It's about accountability. You can't treat us like pawns in your little game. If you cared about the community, you'd listen to us instead of silencing us. The room erupted into murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered nervously among themselves. Susan tried to regain control, insisting we were overreacting, but her words fell flat. The tide had turned, and everyone could feel it. By the end of the meeting, the board reluctantly agreed to suspend construction until the issue was resolved. It wasn't a total victory. We still had work to do, but it was a start. As I left the community center, surrounded by supportive neighbors, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced in weeks. Together, we'd taken the first step toward reclaiming our neighborhood. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could win. In the weeks that followed the meeting, things on Maplewood Lane began to change, slowly at first, but then with a momentum that felt almost unstoppable. The unfinished pool became more than just a construction site. It turned into a symbol of resistance. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started talking, sharing stories, and realizing they weren't alone in their frustrations. What had begun as my personal fight against the HOA grew into something much bigger, a collective effort to reclaim our community. Susan didn't stay around long after that disastrous meeting. The pressure mounted quickly, with neighbors demanding transparency and accountability. Her closest allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her authoritarian tactics. Eventually, she resigned, leaving behind a leadership vacuum. It was messy, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to us again, not to her clipboard or her rules. As for my backyard, it remained scared but salvageable. Concrete slabs and rebar still jutted out awkwardly from the ground, reminders of what could have been. But instead of letting it sit there as a monument to frustration, I decided to transform it into something positive. With help from Rachel, James, and a few other neighbors, we worked together to turn the wreckage into a lush garden. We planted flowers, laid down fresh sod, and even built a small stone pathway winding through the space. Where the foundation of the pool once stood, we placed a bench surrounded by greenery, a quiet spot where Max and I could sit and enjoy the peace. The project brought people closer together. Neighbors who barely knew each other before were now working side by side, laughing and sharing meals while we dug in the dirt. Someone brought lemonade one afternoon. Another showed up with cookies. It wasn't just about fixing my yard. It was about healing the rifts Susan's rain had created. By the time we finished, the garden wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to all of us, a testament to what we could accomplish when we stood united. Looking back, this ordeal taught me more than I ever expected. I learned how easy it is for power to go unchecked when no one speaks up, and how powerful a group of determined individuals can be when they decide to take a stand. I also realized that standing up for yourself doesn't mean going it alone. In fact, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, to trust that others will join your cause because they believe in it too. Max seemed happier too. He finally got his digging privileges back, though he mostly stuck to the flower beds now. Watching him race around the yard, tail wagging furiously, reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. This wasn't just land or property. It was home. And homes are meant to be lived in, loved, and shared. Today, Maplewood Lane feels different. There's laughter again, genuine smiles exchanged between neighbors. People linger outside longer, chatting over fences or hosting impromptu barbecues. Even Mrs. Peterson parks her RV proudly in her driveway, daring anyone to say otherwise. The HOA still exists, but its grip has loosened. New leaders, kinder, more compassionate ones, have taken charge, eager to rebuild trust rather than enforce fear. And me. I've changed too. Before this whole mess, I might have backed down, afraid of making waves or drawing attention to myself. But now, I know better. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing alongside others, refusing to let anyone take away what matters most. Because together, we're stronger than any bulldozer or bureaucracy. So here I am, sitting on my new bench, watching Max chase butterflies in the sunlight. My backyard may never look exactly like it did before, but honestly, I think I like it better this way.